Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone for the invitation to be here with you today. I must say I'm just, received a wonderful infusion of joy and good wishes and just feelings of love being with you. And it's really special. And I hope perhaps one day I can come and join you in person. It's a really, really lovely way to start the Sunday. I'd also like to just extend the land acknowledgement that, this work I'm bringing today is from a paper that I worked on here or in the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples where I live and work at the University of Victoria and in my home. And I also want to add an acknowledgement, of course, of the non-human animals that are also the traditional owners, some of which and species which are with us today and some which aren't. And, some hearing that extension of that acknowledgement might think that actually kind of, seems a little bit disrespectful to bring in consideration of the animals after kind of what has now become very kind of ubiquitous land acknowledgements to signal our commitment to reconciliation and decolonization. But what I want to suggest with my talk today, that for me and for some others, it's actually seen as very symbiotic and synergistic, given what we understand the commitments of reconciliation and decolonization to be. And so that really brings me to the talk today about veganism and the dairy industry and how they relate to these twin commitments of reconciliation and decolonization. So I will just share my brief slide deck with everyone. Okay, so hopefully that is available for all to see. And as I mentioned, the work for this was part of kind of an inquiry that I pursued in a seminar that I teach at the University of Victoria called Animals, Culture, and the Law, and then ended up in a publication in the Journal of Human Rights and Environment out of the UK. If anyone is interested in reading the full analysis, I'm happy to provide that link. But what I'd like to offer today is just very kind of a nutshell version of the analysis laid out there. Okay, so here is the main thesis of today's kind of talk and the fuller analysis in the journal article. So emphasizing veganism's objection not just to the consumption of animal flesh, but to humans consuming dairy, can combat the misleading perception that animal rights concerns and plant-based diets are always inherently opposed to Indigenous worldviews and legal orders, and to the related goals of reconciliation and decolonization in Canada. So let's just review that one more time. The thesis is that when we focus on veganism's objection to dairy, it helps kind of combat a misperception that veganism is always antithetical to the goals that Indigenous peoples and nations have for themselves, including the overarching goals of reconciliation, decolonization in Canada or in other settler colonial states. Okay, so to break this down, I'd like to just present, what this kind of misperception or conflict is and why it's there, and then get to the heart of the thesis to understand veganism as actually a counterforce to settler colonial ideologies and practices, and then very briefly talk about veganism as an ally in contesting human exceptionalism along with Indigenous peoples and cultures and legal orders. Yet it's still discredited in the mainstream as being culturally imperialist. Okay, so why even bother to write a paper or to think about this topic? Well, I think you might agree with me when I say that there is kind of a mainstream perception that animal rights and Indigenous rights conflict. And we have very kind of, multiple high profile representations of this type of framing. Perhaps the most notable, now 9 years old, is Ellen DeGeneres's kind of selfie donation. If you may recall, in the 2014 Oscars, she took a selfie with a lot of Hollywood A-list celebrities, and that went viral. And then the proceeds that came from everyone sharing that selfie through advertising dollars was donated to an organization, Humane Society, that supports combating the seal hunt. And that started kind of a counter protest about kind of the, ostensibly racist and colonialist nature of combating the seal hunt. So you can see a lot of the different kind of hashtags that accrued. And then also scholarly papers followed on this kind of notable cultural moment about the selfie, kind of reappropriated into the language of the seal fee. And so you see many scholarly accounts of departing from the premise that the animal rights concerns conflict or can't be compatible with Indigenous rights concerns in these papers here. And that is not just restricted to the seal hunt in Canada. It is a framing of a conflict that has been kind of notable in other media accounts of veganism, such that, in the last two rows here on the slide, you have the CBC covering stories about Indigenous peoples actually being vegan and how rare that is, that it, should merit kind of CBC coverage, national coverage about it being newsworthy to note that. So, and again, in food, it's not just kind of the media accounts of the seal hunt or some other types of issues about veganism in general. You'll see this kind of conflictual framing of the interests of animals and the interests of Indigenous peoples in multiple scholarly kind of areas of study, including food sovereignty, critical food studies, accounts that are kind of very recent and growing in what is known as North America. Okay, and then of course in my discipline, law, we see it as well. And this perhaps is kind of a key driver of the policies and laws that we then do end up having as we think about what does, reconciliation and decolonization mean in the policy and legal sphere. So here is just one quote from one Supreme Court of Canada case where we see kind of the easy and almost casual framing of Indigenous peoples as being kind of defined by their hunting relationship with animals. So I've just bolded here some keywords from this quote, and this quote is from the 2017 Clyde River case, dealing with some self-government rights for the Inuit. But in suggesting that the relationship of the Inuit to animals here, marine mammals, bowhead whales, narwhals, and so on, is one of hunting and harvesting, it repeats a very common frame in what is known as Canadian constitutional law about Indigenous peoples, which is called Aboriginal law. As you may know, our Constitution has a section 35, that protects existing rights of Aboriginal peoples. And this whole jurisprudence, I think it is, reasonable to argue, is framed by a belief that hunting and fishing and trapping are the sine qua non of Aboriginal rights. Even though Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal traditional practices on which they're based could have related to other activities, for example, gathering, or for example, weaving, or for example, just planting. Yet you have a strong correlation between Aboriginal rights in Canadian law under Section 35 of our Constitution and basically the killing of animals. And we can see the euphemism of harvesting, such that it's not called that. And that's kind of lends to the kind of just very accepted nature of these rights. And so when you think about how the law has kind of enabled a framing of animal interests and indigenous interests, primarily through this constitutional provision of Section 35, what I'm suggesting is that it is always a conflictual framing because of the focus on hunting, fishing, and trapping rights put under the umbrella of quote unquote harvesting. Okay, now there are some scholars who write in the field of Aboriginal law and Indigenous law, and here I've just selected one, that try to write against this framing. And we see the conflictual framing not just in the realm of Section 35 jurisprudence, but also when it comes to kind of legislative proposals and lobbying to, toughen up or to otherwise amplify our anti-cruelty laws that primarily apply to companion animals when they even do apply under our criminal laws. And here, again, we've seen legislative debates where you have politicians and lobbyists suggesting that if we do anything to increase the strength of anti-cruelty laws against animals, that's going to infringe upon Aboriginal rights, as if it's a conflictual relationship. And this scholar, Andrew Brighton, has written against this type of framing, noting kind of almost the perverse implication for the layperson is that when you have arguments that anti-cruelty laws, if they're amplified, are going to hurt Aboriginal rights under Section 35, it suggests that, as he notes, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous cultures, Indigenous laws are somehow more or antithetical to animals than Canadian laws, which there's a strong army to say is actually the reverse situation when you think of the overall dismal situation of animals under Canadian law in terms of their legal status and how we're allowed to treat them as property. So this type of idea that one set of rights conflicts with another set of rights, so here Indigenous rights versus animal rights, and that they're not compatible and never will be, is not something that is unique to kind of the Indigenous animal dynamic. We have seen a longstanding concern about this in the area of feminist theory and feminist rights, and thinking about what's needed to protect women and girls. In a very well-known article that generated a lot of critique, you have kind of this debate playing out. So Susan Moller-Oken, a political theorist, a late political theorist, wrote an article, "Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women?" basically suggesting that it was, that you couldn't possibly have protection for cultural rights for ethnic minorities in liberal states and protect the interests of women and children because of her perception that cultural rights were always going to be antithetical to the interests of women and children who needed a liberal state to kind of protect them from cultural tyranny in kind of gender adverse cultures. So then you had a lot of post-colonial feminists writing back or writing against Professor Oken's premise, suggesting that no, there is a way to understand respect for the rights of cultural minorities and the respect for women and children within those cultures as compatible. They're not necessarily antithetical. It's not to say they don't ever conflict, because we know they do, but it's not to suggest that they're always going to conflict, or that somehow the rights of women and children are better in liberal cultures, right? So really vibrant, long-standing debate. And one that's taken up by Indigenous feminists and women themselves in various texts, talking about how to think about Indigenous self-government, or even Aboriginal rights under Canadian law for Indigenous peoples, and respect for the women and girls within these Indigenous cultures. So not necessarily antithetical, perhaps tense at times, definitely, perhaps sometimes incompatible, but not like a universal kind of blanket kind of conflictual framing. Okay, but I think as much as we have come in society to perhaps accept more widely that it is possible to promote respect for cultural rights for kind of vulnerable cultural communities and respect gender rights and the rights of girls, and children generally. For example, that is part of what respect for reconciliation and decolonization is, to give more authority to Indigenous self-government and recognize a nation-to-nation relationship, right? And so we wouldn't, necessarily be doing that if we thought there was a great risk to women and girls in those communities. The debate over animals and Indigenous rights and the compatibility is still seen not to kind of have areas of overlap or compatibility. So how can we get to seeing some compatibility? Okay, so here's where we can think of veganism as a counterforce to actually settler colonial ideologies and practices. All right. When we think of animal rights as a position against hunting or fishing or trapping, and if we only think of animal rights advocacy as that, we quickly come into conflictual framing with Indigenous rights, which are so much perceived to be about hunting, fishing, and trapping. If instead we start to think about animal rights advocacy through the lens of veganism, which we understand as a real pushback against the dairy industry, particularly, our mind and attention go elsewhere, right? And we quickly start to see the multiple points of synergies between kind of what we come to understand as a general respect, without stereotyping or homogenizing needlessly, but a general respect in Indigenous cultures and legal orders for more than human life forms and more than human life is kin to humans, and understanding the families and communities of more than human life forms, and what animal rights advocacy is saying about the dairy industry. Okay, so what are animal advocates saying about the dairy industry? Here I want to concentrate on just feminist advocacy, which is really vibrant in this area. These books are just two examples of feminist scholars talking about the multiple harms in the dairy industry to the cows as beings, as mothers, and to the children of the cows, the calves, in the industry. So just as very quick examples, we can think, of course, of the confinement of the cows, which is similar to other animals in animal-based food systems, the forced insemination of the cows, which is also similar. But there are some unique harms that come out of the dairy industry as well, in terms of the pressure on bovine bodies, on the mothers to be pregnant, so that they're producing milk and lactating at the same time, which is an incredible pressure on a mammalian body to bear over repeated and frequent cycles. If you look at the typical life of a dairy cow caught in intensive farming, it is but a fraction of what would be perceived to be the natural lifespan. But what feminist accounts really impress upon is the separation of the mother and calves that happen. That is the kind of, whole enabling factor of the dairy industry. Something that most of us don't pause to think about is that when we enjoy dairy-based ice cream or any other product, that milk is only there because the cow had a baby, right? That's why mammals lactate, female mammals lactate, because there was a baby. And so the dairy industry depends on taking those babies away from their mothers, putting the male ones perhaps into the veal industry, but for the dairy industry, there wouldn't be the veal industry, and the female ones back into the reproductive cycle. Okay, so when we think of the dairy industry, our mind can understand the critique of it by feminist animal scholars in law and otherwise as something that's in association with the reproductive rights movement. When we see feminists and look at feminist accounts of what's wrong with the dairy industry, we understand it to be reproductive rights justice driven. So feminists who critique the dairy industry position the cows as beings who are for whom their reproductive rights should be respected, who should be seen as beings in and of themselves, who have rights to their bodies, and whose rights need to be protected. So very much like the women's movement on reproductive rights. Also, when we think about the separation of calves, that is central to the dairy industry from their mothers and their quick killing or their quick commodification into veal or otherwise, we understand it also as being bound by human rights concerns about separation of families, whether at the borders that humans have constructed, for example, between the United States and Mexico or elsewhere. And so the kind of veganism understood as an objection to dairy, what I'm suggesting is connects us to kind of feminist reproductive rights. Okay, it also connects us to critiques of kind of the nature of colonialism, how the history of colonialism in North America, in Canada as well, what we know as Canada, and kind of adjacent concerns about the spread of Eurocentrism, whiteness and white supremacy, and just neo-colonial politics in general. So how can we see this? There is really great scholarly literature, 2 books of which are just sampled here, that talk about one of the critical drivers of colonialism in what is now known as Canada, the United States, as being the introduction of European food practices and European farmed animals to these lands. So you can see just from the titles of these books, Cattle Colonialism and Creatures of Empire, how animals were, and the kind of the desire to have the same animals from Europe and eat the same foods and drink the same animal-based substances as being critical to the expansion of kind of or incursion and then appropriation and genocide of Indigenous peoples for the grabbing of land by colonial forces. We can also, look at statistics about the worldwide prevalence of what is commonly known as lactose intolerance. And we can see how it tracks on to kind of a racialized mapping of the world in terms of who is able to kind of drink milk because of, more historical practices going back generations and generations, and who is not, such that some post-colonial, decolonial, critical race scholars actually suggest that lactose kind of normativity is not to be able to drink milk products, whereas drinking milk is presented to us as universal and natural, when in fact, if we take these statistics seriously, it really isn't for most of the world outside of European and some other small pockets of the world. We can also connect veganism and the objection to the dairy industry to anti-racist concerns about white supremacy historically and white supremacy today. So if we look at critical race theory and post-colonial legal history and cultural history that traces kind of the rise of movements, overt racist movements like the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, we will see that ideas about what food to eat and what to drink were really important to spreading that type of ideology. And milk was really a part of the kind of ideology of what makes kind of the white race better than everyone else and what makes Europeans better than everyone else and stronger than everyone else. So we have lots of historic accounts of that, but you can kind of also see it in contemporary marketing as well, right? We still present to children, these mobile classrooms are still going on, even though dairy was finally delisted, despite the intense lobbying from the Canada Food Guide a few years ago as an important food group, presenting drinking milk as natural to kids, right? As everyone can do it. And we still see kind of the associations of whiteness that are implicit in the marketing that attends to the dairy industry. So this is not like a coincidence. it is part of the idea we have of milk as embodying goodness, purity, milk being white, right? And so it tracks on to kind of racial and colonial histories that way as well. And then finally, another way that we can understand veganism as being aligned with decolonial politics rather than against them, if we concentrate on the dairy industry and the critique of the dairy industry, is to understand the critique that feminists and other scholars have, highlighted as to how the dairy industry globalized. How did the drinking of another mammal's milk become so globally ubiquitous? Let's just pause, right? When we drink cow's milk or perhaps buffalo milk or goat's milk, this is another mammal's milk, which no other mammal does, right? No other mammal drinks another mammal's milk except humans. And so unless we, force them to. And this practice went from, a fraction of the world in kind of Northern Europe and extended everywhere else. So this happened through multinational marketing and campaigns, a very famous one, which is in India, where as markets, literally dwindled for the intense supplies of milk that were being produced, new markets for the substance and product had to be created elsewhere. And this was done through the British Empire building and through the contacts that lasted even after former colonies became independent. And it continued on through very well-known campaigns of Nestle that, created boycotts some decades ago, where human nursing was thought to be replaced by cow-based milk products. And women in the global South were told, right, that nursing was not the best for their baby. The best thing was this Nestle product. So just to recap what we've talked about, when we focus on dairy industry, and we understand, of course, that veganism is a critique of dairy. That's what veganism is, if we contrast it with vegetarianism, as well as eggs. We can see multiple points of compatibility with decolonial politics, with ambitions for decolonization and reconciliation in Canada. In other words, we can see multiple points of colonial contestation. The first we briefly discussed was that a critique of dairy aligns with the critique of settler colonial familial ideologies, right? It's very hard to say that Indigenous cultures or legal orders are against the bonds of mothers with their children, or a family staying together, right? In a way, when we think of animal rights advocacy as just about hunting, some people will quickly say, well, what about Indigenous practices of hunting? Right? With dairy, that's just not possible. You quickly see the alignment. You also see the alignment on the second point, because critiques of the dairy industry call out the Eurocentric nature of milk consumption that masquerades as universal and healthy for everyone, but actually isn't. It actually tracks on to kind of a colonial history of the rise of milk, right? Third way of seeing a critique of dairy through veganism as very much aligned with an ethos of decolonization in Canada and the world over is to understand that milk was actually a vector of white supremacy in the global North historically, and retains, this type of kind of marketing imprint today, in terms of, how milk is presented to us as a normal, natural, good thing to drink and feed your kids. And then fourth, we can also see kind of the ethnocentric and new colonial food politics of kind of the major dairy multinationals like Nestle in trying to create more markets for their products in the global South in a way that that type of marketing would just not work in the global North, and taking advantage of the vulnerabilities of women, particularly in the global South, to do so in terms of what they should feed their human offspring. Okay, so if we think of all of what we just said, it is possible to understand both veganism and Indigenous worldviews as being on the eco side of this slide, right? As opposed to the ego slide on the left, which is more kind of conversant with, let's say, European kind of mindsets about human-animal relations that have been dominant since, Enlightenment period onward, very much reflected in our Canadian legal order of who's at the top and who doesn't even count as a legal subject. So both in the common law and civil law, as much as in some pockets, we might understand animals to be sentient, for example, through anti-cruelty statutes, or even through Quebec's somewhat recent kind of symbolic declaration that animals are sentient. These legal systems, the common law legal system from Britain and the civil law legal system from France that we've inherited and are with us as colonial legal systems in Canada, do not recognize animals as legal subjects, but overwhelmingly classify them as property. They're not even in kind of the zone of legal visibility. Whereas on the right side, if we think of Indigenous legal orders as, much more accounting for animals as legal subjects, even as legal persons, as understanding animals as being part of families and communities, even understanding animals as kin, we can understand their kind of mutual connection to animal advocates and their critique of the dairy industry, especially in feminist understandings of the critique of the dairy industry that talk about reproductive rights and kind of the gendered neocolonial practices of multinationals in this area. Okay, I'd just like to point everyone to the scholarship of an Indigenous feminist scholar, Margaret Robinson, who teaches at Dalhousie University, is a Canada Research Chair, who makes these connections with kind of ecofeminist theory, vegan advocacy, and Indigenous cultures in her scholarship, as well as the writings of other Indigenous feminists who have also made these connections. I would also just point you to a recent text where, extensions of what I'm talking about today, not just with respect to veganism, but thinking about compatibility of animal advocacy and anti-colonial perspectives more fully on other topics. This book would also be something that I would highly commend to you, edited by feminist philosophers Kelly Struthers Munford and Chloe Taylor. And then finally, I would just like to kind of close with this image and a story from the kind of 10-year-old article now by Greta Gard, a longstanding ecofeminist who wrote a really classic essay called The Feminist kind of Post-Colonial Feminist Milk Studies, where all the points I made today, most of them she has drawn out in that analysis. And I'd like to share a story that she ends with at the end of her article. And whether, it is true or not, I think is besides the point, because at some point in some kind of farm, we know that it likely is true. And what she shares at the end of her highly academic analysis is an account she overheard from a veterinarian working on a farm that wasn't, kind of the classic intensive farm that we know now, allowed some more space and autonomy for the animals, but still very much was a dairy farm. And she shares an account of a mother cow who, after multiple cycles and lived experience of having her calf taken from her after 9-month gestation period, just like human mammalian mothers, and being so incredibly attached, as we know cows are, to their offspring. When she had twins, took one of those twins and hid them away on part of the land where she could, and came back for her normal nursing expectations and to the farmer, and of course sacrificed the other twin that the owner had taken away immediately, not knowing that she had given birth to twins. And so in Greta Presser-Gard's account, she talks about this as a Sophie's choice. And I'm sure many of us will know that reference of William Styron's book and film starring Meryl Streep. She made a Sophie's choice here of her children. And I have to share that I can tell this story with you now without copious amounts of tears flowing from me. But when I first heard it and read it, it's like for me, it was one of those stories that will always stay with me, that will always be in my mind. And I myself was nursing my own little one at that time, reading this work and, and thinking about it at a very personal level. And for myself, I would also share that as much as I had, thought about animal rights and had been an animal law scholar before I had my own human nursing experience, I don't think I really understood the harm of the dairy industry until I had that personal experience, and reading these accounts meant so much to me. So all of this to say, and I can stop sharing the screen here. If we understand animal rights, especially veganism, as an objection to these types of commodified practices and devastations of animal bonds and communities, it very much aligns with progressive politics, and certainly with what is understood to be commitments to reconciliation and decolonization. The problem is that when we mention the topic animal rights, because of kind of legal framings, media framings, and even other scholarly framings, we quickly encounter kind of the perception that animal rights must be conflictual to Indigenous rights, or Indigenous worldviews, and these goals that we have through reconciliation and decolonization because of the hunting question. So I think that is a misperception, but it's really hard to get around that framing between hunting and non-hunting. If we focus on veganism as a dairy objection, we can quickly avoid kind of that framing, and really in multiple ways that I've just suggested for here, understand how the kind of animal rights concerns and Indigenous rights concerns can be seen as very symbiotic and mutually supporting, rather than antithetical and undermining. Thank you.